From oil paintings blackened by tobacco smoke, to broken century-old marble statues, from books ripping apart at the seams to faded Italian murals, these items were in desperate need of repairs. We spoke with specialists to find out how they repair and restore centuries-old works of art.
My name is Sarah Drew, and I work as an art conservator at Center Art Studio in New York City. This is a portrait of Madame Vestries. The first thing we do is inspect the painting with a black light to understand what all of the issues are. So you see the purple light, and then you see kind of like the greenish light. That indicates to us that there's like a heavy, thick, old varnish on that surface. If there wasn't that, you would just see pure purple. You couldn't make out any sort of contrast or light in the background. The ornament and the details on her clothes were completely obscured. There was something on her head. We weren't sure if it was a hat or if it was hair. When you're running the Q-tip over the painting, it can be quite black or quite orange or yellow, depending on what you're taking off. Her skin was beautiful. It was bright. It had brush strokes, color contrast, light. The first step of removing the painting from the stretcher is to take out all of the tacks that are holding the sides of the canvas onto the stretcher. I'll save them, and I'm going to reuse them later. You can see me using a knife to separate the lining canvas fully from the stretcher. Now comes the riskiest part, separating the painting from the stretcher. You want to be very careful because if the paint is not stable, you risk bending the painting and causing flaking or further damage. I need to cut strips of linen and attach them to the canvas so that I can then put the whole piece back together again. I cut strips of Eva, which is a conservator's adhesive. I then put the painting on the stretcher and used tacks to reattach the painting to its stretcher. Then I filled with a water-based putty areas of damage. And I overfill the areas a little bit, and then I come back in with a damp cotton swab and clean up those fills. Also, the original canvas doesn't extend quite to the edges of the stretcher, so I need to go and fill about 1/4 of an inch around the entire perimeter of the painting. Once the painting is filled, I will begin the retouching process. I will use a paint that is specifically designed for conservation work. You're just trying to match the color to the color that the artist put there and making sure that you're not painting over any of that original paint. There's two types of in-painting that I will do here. The first is in-painting over the fills that I just made. The second is in-painting the background. And this is the area that was previously overcleaned by the other restorer. It's really important to use a conservation paint that dissolves in a solvent that is different than the original paint. And this allows our paint to be completely reversible. We could easily use that solvent to take off our paint, and then the original paint would be unaffected. Then I will be ready for varnish. We use a completely reversible, non-yellowing varnish. I need to wipe off the surface of the painting with just a cloth because, like anything, it can accumulate little particles of dust, little hairs. I want to make sure that that surface is as clean as possible. So once I wipe it off, I will brush on the varnish. When you brush on the varnish, those fills, that in-painting, it all kind of blends cohesively into the background and into the surface of the painting, and it just looks complete. And the restoration is complete. I'm restoring a portrait of Edmund Holland that was painted in 1895. This painting is an oil on canvas, and it is in a painted and gilt wood frame. Both the painting and the frame are extremely dirty. The painting has a very yellow varnish on its surface, and the frame has many cracks and chips and loose areas that we will fix. So the first thing is to unbox it when it arrives and to do an initial assessment, take note of any condition issues, and then you start the deconstruction process. We're going to work on the painting and the frame separately. The painting is held into the frame with nails, so I use pliers to bend the nails out, and it's pretty easy. There were only a few of them. I'm going to work on restoring the painting. My colleague Karen is going to work on restoring the frame. So we bring the frame into our wood room so Karen can get started working on that. I begin by taking the painting off the stretcher. So in order to do this, I remove the tacks along the sides of the stretcher that are holding the canvas tightly onto the stretcher. I use pliers to pull these tacks out, and that loosens the painting and allows it to be a free piece of canvas again. When the painting comes off the stretcher, it's not uncommon for a painting to not lie flat because it's been held bent for decades. So I cut a piece of silicone release paper and use a small tacking iron to iron down the edges of the canvas so it lays flat. I do an initial vacuum to remove all the bulky, loose, obvious dust that is accumulated on the back of the canvas and the front of the canvas. After I vacuum, I use a vulcanized rubber sponge to remove more surface dust and dirt that is a little bit more ingrained into the surface of the canvas. This is a specially made sponge that is very porous and pulls dirt off of surfaces that might be slightly more ingrained into the surfaces. We use light pressure with the sponge, and we tend to go in straight lines as opposed to circular or scrubbing patterns. We do a surfactant cleaning to remove grease and grime and oily substances off the surface of the painting. At this point, I'm still not doing anything to affect the varnish or the underlying paint or anything like that. We use cotton swabs dipped in a solution of the surfactant soap and water typically. Wet the swab and then wipe the swab in typically circular motions over small areas of the canvas at a time. And this is a very controlled way to remove the sticky, grimy substances that accumulate on a painting surface over time. The soap solution also removed overpaint from a previous restorer. There are a number of tears in the canvas that have been repaired by somebody else, and they were not repaired very well. So I removed all that off. Underneath, the previous restorer had put a layer of paper on the surface of the painting, which is an odd thing to do, so I used a scalpel to scrape that off. But between the heat gun and the scalpel, we can scrape off the paper, and we will repair these areas by patching them on the back and using a putty to fill in just the crack and make sure that we are not covering over any of the original paint. Once I've done my surfactant cleaning, I am ready to assess the painting with a black light and do some solvent tests to see what will cut through the varnish and get down to the original paint layer. I use an ultraviolet black light to assess the surface, and this light allows me to see things that are going on under the surface of the varnish that might not be apparent to a naked eye. I assemble various solvents that I believe will be contenders for cleaning, and I do very small test cleanings in discrete areas on the canvas to test and work out a plan for cleaning the entire surface of the canvas. And I check my work with a black light to make sure that what I'm doing is working. If I shine the black light over my test cleaning, I want to see that that test cleaning window is reflecting back purple. That means that I've cut through that varnish, I've gotten down to the original paint, and it informs me and makes me feel comfortable moving forward to work in larger areas. But similar to the surfactant cleaning, I use large cotton swabs to work my way over the entire surface of the painting, and it's very satisfying to see all the old yellow varnish come off. I saved the face for last in this instance, mostly because it's the most dramatic part of the cleaning process, and so it's good motivation to keep going, and we want to get to the face, so that's the most fun part to clean. It also became apparent Once I removed all the varnish, that this painting, which had been treated by this other restorer, had been cleaned previously. However, it was cleaned a little too aggressively. So there were areas where the original paint had become thin. So now I'm realizing that I have maybe a lot more retouching in my future than I maybe anticipated. Once the painting is clean, we remove the old patches and the old strip lining canvas that's on the back of the painting. Lansing, who is the owner of the studio, is doing this part. Lansing is taking off the old patches and the old strips. To do this, he uses a hot air gun to heat up the patches, and this loosens up the old adhesive and allows Lansing to take a metal tool to lift off the patch, and we're left with the original canvas. We will strip line the edges of the canvas. This is so we will be able to re-stretch the painting tightly onto the stretcher. We cut strips of linen and adhere conservator's adhesive to the strips, and this is heat activated. So we use an iron to attach these strips to the back of the original canvas. We also will do the same technique for the patches that on the back, and these patches will repair the rips that are in the canvas's surface. We glue down the frayed edges of the strip lining so they also lay flat against the original canvas. Lansing will re-stretch the painting onto its original stretcher. He marks the middle of all four sides of the painting and all four sides of the stretcher, and then he lays the loose canvas onto the stretcher, aligns the marks, and then begins the stretching process. He will use a tacking hammer and the original tacks that I removed earlier that we saved to reattach the canvas to the stretcher. Now my colleague Tyler will be applying a layer of isolation varnish to the painting surface to protect all the original paint and create a barrier between the original paint and the paint and materials that I'm going to apply. We're using a reversible non-yellowing conservator's varnish that's easily removable. We brush it onto the painting surface all over and allow it to dry. At this point, we put the keys in the back of the stretcher and tap the keys to make the surface of the painting completely taut on the stretcher. Once the canvas is taut, we use a water-based putty to fill the cracks in the canvas's surface and fill in any areas along the edges or wherever it might need to have a surface evened out. I select the colors that I expect I will need for retouching. We're using Gamblin conservation paints. These are paints that are specifically designed for conservation work, and they're soluble in solvents that are different than solvents that will affect the oil paint. So again, it's always very easy to remove for whatever reason. I mix the colors to try to match the original color as best as possible. I'll put paint on the surface. If it looks correct, I'll continue. If I need to alter it, I will. One of the issues with this painting was that it has been previously over-cleaned by another restorer. To fix all this, I will remove the previous restorer's paint and in-paint in just those areas of loss where it's thin with our own conservation paint, stippling very carefully in very, very, very small areas to make the painting look complete again. I'm very careful to only put this conservation paint in the areas of loss. I never want to cover up any original paint or do anything to obstruct the original materials that the artist put there. I've in-paint the entirety of the canvas, and we do a final coat of varnish again. This final coat, it's the moment of truth. It brings out all the work, and once the final layer of varnish is on and it dries, the painting restoration is complete. So now there's the whole frame restoration. Karen does an all-over vacuuming and then a sponge treatment of the frame surface to remove any loose dust. Now we clean the frame. We use the same surfactant soap that we use on the painting surface. 2 of the 4 mitered corners on the frame have very large gaps. So we first will use a epoxy putty to fill these areas and then come in and fill over that with a water-based putty. We fill the large ones. It's always a judgment call, but we leave the smaller ones to retain an element of age. The ornament detail on 2 corners of the frame are missing. We need to make a mold of the ornament that does exist. Then we use a plaster to actually cast a replacement. Karen glues them down onto the frame, does a little bit more shaping, and then we're ready to retouch the frame. Once we have the frame retouched, we apply shellac to protect our work and make sure it's all sealed. Now the painting and the frame restorations are complete. We put the painting into the frame and we hang the painting up on the wall and admire our work.
My team and I are going to walk you through step by step how we restore a 250-plus-year-old French plaster and gilt wood frame. This frame was brought to us by a private client along with a painting that we will restore as well. The frame, when it came to us, was extremely dirty and it needed a lot of structural repairs. There was a lot of ornament that was missing. When we start cleaning the frame, we start with the back. There's a lot of resin on the back of the frame, so we use a scalpel to scrape this resin off. It's likely some sort of polyurethane from a previous restoration. That stuff is tricky to remove, so mechanically removing it with a scalpel is the best approach. Once we have the back clean, we flip the frame right side up and we start the front cleaning. We commonly use cotton swabs to clean the surface of a frame, but we also are going to be using micro metal tools, literally the same tools that a dentist will use, to really get into all of the small little recesses. We use a variety of solvents which lift the dirt up and allow us to then take swabs to lift the dirt away. This frame was originally water gilded, which means gold leaf was applied to it. Because of that, we have to be very careful with our cleaning because it would be very easy to remove that original gilding. We never want to make something look brand new. So while we are going into the recesses and we are removing the dirt, we don't want to entirely remove all of that built-up patina. We want to retain an element of age. The main issue with the back of this frame is that it has been expanded to take a larger piece of art than it was originally built for. The first time we saw it, we knew that we were going to have to disassemble it and build it back up properly. In order to put the frame back properly, we are using a product called fish glue, which is a super condensed fish product. It's a very traditional adhesive to use in conservation, and it's very strong. And then we align the frame. Once we feel that all the structural work has been completed, we move on to filling in the missing areas of the frame. 3 of the 4 corners are completely missing their corner ornament. Luckily, we have 1 corner that is completely intact. That works to our advantage in this case because we will be able to take a silicone mold of this corner and then cast plaster replicas of it. To make a mold off the frame, we use a silicone compound. Once you have it mixed together, you can lay it over a part of the frame that you want to replicate. It cures over the course of about 20 or 30 minutes. Once it's fully cured, you can carefully peel it off the frame. And you will have the imprint of the shape of the frame that you want to replicate in that mold. We are using plaster to cast the molds. So we mix up a batch of plaster. And we pour it into the silicone mold. Once the plaster has dried, we can pop that out of the mold. To prepare the frame to receive the plaster casts, we need to remove some of the plaster material that's already on it. We use a hammer and chisel to carve away a recess that will allow the cast piece to sit flush in the frame. We will shape and finesse these cast pieces to make sure that they fit properly in the areas where we're going to be applying them. We use sandpaper in different grits. We are using fish glue, again, to adhere the cast pieces onto the frame. When we feel like the frame is physically complete, it is time to move on to the color work. The first layer of paint that we are applying to the frame is a primer. This is a Venetian red primer, and that just creates a very nice red base layer for us to work off of. We are gold leafing the ornaments in the corners of this frame. This is a process called gilding. The frame was originally gilded with gold leaf, and so whenever possible we like to use the original materials in our restoration just so the object has as much integrity to the original as possible. The first step to gilding, after you've applied the base layer, is to apply a sizing medium, and this is brushed onto the plaster and it is allowed to dry for about 30 minutes. It gets tacky, and once it's tacky, it's in the right state to accept the gold leaf. It is very, very delicate, so you can't touch it with your hands, it will just crumble. So in order to handle it, Karen, one of our team members, is using a horsehair brush and lay it onto the ornament that we want to gild. We also will use squirrel hair brushes to brush it on and make sure that it's adhering to all of the recesses and all of the areas of the frame. Once the gold leaf is applied, we move on to the in-painting process. And we are going to paint over the gold leaf to tone it down slightly, and also over all of the fills that we've made on the frame. And we use a combination of conservation colors, which are paints that are specifically designed for conservation work. It is literally a trial and error process. Often we will make a color, we'll have to adjust it, correct it a little bit. This is where the frame starts to really look like one whole object again. The next step is to apply a layer of shellac, and this just serves as a top coat. It protects all of our work. It also makes everything just have a cohesive finish and sheen. We're really happy with how this restoration came out. We have done a lot to restore the structural integrity and the visual integrity of this frame, and we hope the client can enjoy the frame for years to come. I'm going to walk you through how my team and I restore a 19th century Italian marble sculpture and its alabaster base. So it's been broken, it's been previously repaired. It came to us broken again. This work of art is comprised of 4 separate pieces that includes the marble bust, its socle base, and a pedestal, which is in 2 parts, a top and a column. We're going to clean the bust, the socle base, and the pedestal components all separately. We start out on all of the pieces by using a surfactant detergent diluted in distilled water and spray it onto the marble and the alabaster. We want to use what we need to properly clean a piece, but we never want to do anything that's too harsh. And this surfactant is very gentle, and it lifts the dirt off the surface, kind of breaks the surface tension between the dirt and the surface, and allows us to wipe or swab away the accumulated surface dirt and debris. The column is quite dirty, and this is because a pedestal column sits on the floor, and the dirt from the floor, from people's shoes, it all gets brought up onto that surface. We also use surfactant gels, particularly in areas that might be a little bit more stubborn to clean. When restoring something so old, you have to be mindful of the age of the piece. So we never want to remove all of the dirt out of all of the recesses and completely remove the patina that's built up on an item of age, because that would end up looking incorrect and inappropriate. So the top of the pedestal and the socle base that the bust sits directly on have both been previously repaired twice with the same types of glue. We need to entirely remove all of this old adhesive that's not functional, it's yellowing, it's not good for the marble to have on its surface. So we want to make sure we get all of it off. So we are using a combination of scalpels. This is also a time where you have to be very careful, because marble is very susceptible and alabaster is very, very susceptible to scratching. So when you're using those very sharp tools, you want to make sure that you are only scraping off the glue and you're not accidentally nicking the surrounding surface area. We use a number of visual aids to help us in the conservation process. One tool that's very helpful is a small spotlight. This is a very direct targeted light that allows us to very clearly see the area that we are working on. We also use a blacklight, which is very useful because the UV light allows us to see imperfections and residues on the surface that are not visible to the regular human eye. To attach the broken items back together, we are going to use a special conservation epoxy. It is called Ebotech. This is a two-part epoxy that you combine together. When you first mix it, it can be quite liquidy. So we allow it to sit for a little bit of time just to develop a little bit more of a viscous quality. We are going to permanently attach the marble to the sockle base. We're going to reuse the original metal rod. Once we have it at the right depth, we put the pin in the hole of the bust and we use our epoxy. Pour that into the recess. And then we put the base on the marble, check it for alignment, front to back and left to right, and allow that to cure for a little while. To ensure that the repair of the top of the pedestal is extremely strong, we are going to pin the pieces in addition to epoxying them. We are going to take a stainless steel rod. Stainless steel is desirable because it's not going to rust or change over time. We mark on the outside of the piece where we're going to drill holes to take the pins. And we are using our ancient drill press. Once we have the holes, we have the pins, we then can use our epoxy to attach the two pieces back together. We are going to fill the cracks in the sculpture with plaster. We are applying the plaster with small metal tools. We tend to err on the side of overfilling because it's very easy to remove the plaster material. The plaster cures quickly, so you want to make sure that you're getting enough on while it's still workable. Once we've filled the cracks and we've allowed the plaster to fully dry, we are going to sand, particularly the alabaster base, which had a large crack throughout the entire thing. We are going to sand that down with different grits of sandpaper. In painting a marble sculpture is really the same technique that we use for any other sculpture or a painting. We are using our standard Gamblin conservation colors. We mix them up to get the right color. In this instance, because the marble and the alabaster are sort of translucent, it makes our job a little trickier because we're trying to replicate translucency on an opaque fill. In this instance, you really can't mix one color and apply it to the whole fill. You have to do thin washes of different colors to mimic the texture and the veining of the stone material. We are going to polish the alabaster base, and we use a very large polishing wheel for this, and we use polishing compound applied to the wheel. And that polishing compound comes in a variety of grits. We use very fine ones in this instance, so it doesn't damage the alabaster. The final step of the conservation is to wax each piece of the sculpture. So we are using a very, very fine microcrystalline wax, and we apply this over the whole surface of each one of the pieces, allow it to dry for just a little bit, and then buff it off very gently with soft cloths. This wax is important. It not only makes the stone look good visually, it also serves as a protective layer between the stone and the elements. Once all of the components are complete in their own right, we do a final assembly, and this is how the piece will be ultimately displayed at the client's home. We are very satisfied with how the whole piece came out. We know the client loves this piece and has had it broken for a long time. We think she's going to be very happy.
My name is Sophia Bogle. I've been restoring books for over 25 years, and I started my company Save Your Books so that anyone can learn archival book repair. The book I'm restoring today is the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales book from the late 1800s, early 1900s. The first thing that we do in pretty much any full restoration is we have to separate the cover from the text block. The tool that I prefer to use is the book repair knife. It has a rounded tip and is less likely to do damage that you did not intend as an X-Acto knife would. I'm removing the old tape. It's very acidic, and if I leave it on the book at all, it's going to affect the book later on. When you're removing some of the original material and you know you're going to be replacing it with something, it's good to mark where it was in relationship to the other materials. And so in this case, I've used a pencil and a piece of paper to mark where the original went. I'm using a 100 grit sanding block to clean the edges of these boards off. It makes a nice clean edge. A lot of general cleaning can be done using a book repair knife. I'm using the book repair knife to just remove some clumpy bits that are stuck to the end paper. When you're repairing a book, usually all the pages are still connected, and there are some pages that will benefit from this washing technique that I have. It'll help us to get the tape off of the page in a way that you couldn't do if it was attached to the book still. To wash a page to get rid of the tape, you just have to put it in fairly hot water. You aren't going to need any additives to clean these pages. It's just hot water. It's surprisingly effective. It can sit in the water for hours. You're also just going to have to be very delicate with the paper because it's in a more delicate state when it's in the water. I'm using a micro spatula to help separate the pages, and I'm also using a ruler to help hold down the other page. You can use a soft brush to help you to brush away the old adhesive. When you're touching up anything black on a cover, you're going to want to use an archival pen. It's the 0.08 micron pen, and it is archival ink. The smaller the tip, the better in a way. Do not use a Sharpie. Those will damage and discolor. While I was cleaning, I also noticed that some of the gilt stamping has been removed. When I'm using the word gilt, gilt refers to gold, so it's gold stamping on the cover. Some people would call it embossing. Originally, this was stamped with hot metal plates with foil coming down onto the book. The best way to fill in gilt stamping is to use shell gold. I'm using a liner brush, and I have all the control in the world. You're gonna make mistakes. You can actually remove the gilt by using a cuticle stick, and then you can clean up your gilt. If you want to match the color of your book and do touch-up on the covers, it's not as hard as you might think. You look at this is a greenish brown. The brownish colors that tend to be on these older books, they're muddy looking. And the way to get to that muddy looking color is to go across the color wheel from the color you think it is and add that other color to make it more muddy looking. When you find tears on your pages and you want to repair them, I highly recommend using Japanese tissue that's thin and an archival paste, such as what I have here, which is nori paste. It's a rice starch paste. A really thin tissue is going to be better than a thicker tissue. You don't need very much paste. You get everything ready. You've got your book in the cover, right side up. You're going to be gluing all of those materials. You're going to glue that mull and that little hinge, and you're gluing that decorative end sheet back, and then you're going to close the cover. And then you slip a sheet of wax paper in, and then you put the pressing board in. When I discovered that there were pages missing from this book, I found a version of the story that connected to where the book started with the pages missing. I used paper that's called antique end leaf. I am using a colored pencil to color the edges of the new pages that I added to the book. I don't want them to pop out. I don't want it to look obvious that I added these new pages. And that's it. That's our book.
Well, my name is Andrea Soldi Sabatini. I'm the CEO and founder of Rurio. It's a farm where it aims to produce top quality olive oil in Tuscany. Today I'm going to walk you through how Marco restores this beautiful 583 years old fresco. The first work that we have to do is to consolidate the walls. The first thing is then really to take the stones that are unstable, take them off, consolidate whatever is underneath, and then put the stones back to their places. In this large fresco there are cracks here and there, so the next step is to consolidate these cracks. The cracks gets consolidated with resin, special resin. The next step is now to remove the plasters that have been painted over the fresco in the last few centuries. And to do that, Marco, the restorer, needs to get a chirurgical scalpel and remove every single bit and pieces out of this huge surface. And it's a very delicate work because if you are not precise enough, of course, you can damage the fresco itself. Now that the plaster has been removed, we can apply Japanese paper soaked with water and ammonium carbonate. This is a very delicate process, and the reason why we are doing it is because thanks to the Japanese paper, all the dirt and all the external component get away from the fresco. And there is a process that can last up to 6 months. After all this work, as you can see, the fresco is revealing itself. Some of the colors are now vivid. What was underneath the plaster, fortunately, is still there for most of it. We are actually applying again Japanese paper soaked with a different product, carbonate hydroxide. And this is a very important part of the fresco restoration because it stabilizes the fresco itself. Now that all these processes are completed, Marco can start the second phase of the restoration. As you can see, there's a lot of gaps in the fresco because some of the paint has faded, some others were lost. He's going to use a very tiny, small brush, and he's going to use natural pigment like they were used back in the 1400s. There has been the surveillance of the Italian authority over this fresco. We are not allowed in Italy to paint back anything. It is not present. The whole restoration took a long time. It took 18 months. We are very proud that we didn't lose this piece of art in Tuscany.